We have been looking at worship in its simplest form as recognizing and acknowledging God's worth, as bowing in humility before Him, and as serving, which involves not just general obedience, but observing the forms God directed His worship and service to take. All of these are intended to help us know and understand God better. We should not worship God in the way that we choose, because then we are trying to make God fit into our mold instead of hearing what He has to say about Himself. In hearing God speak about Himself, we have focused on His holiness and His love, God's two essential qualities. We can see how all His other qualities are kind of rooted in these, and we've seen how these two qualities make worship necessary for humans, and especially God's people. Worship is the appropriate response to a God of holy love. Any series on Christian worship would be incomplete without mention of Romans 12:1 and 2, which says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will." Last week, we ended by talking about sacrifices, that they were intended to both remind people of God's holiness and their own unworthiness, while at the same time making it possible for them to draw near to God. We talked about Jesus, how Jesus is our sacrifice, making it possible for us to draw near to God. This passage, however, says that we are the sacrifice being offered to God, and that is our true and proper worship. So this week we will focus more on being living sacrifices as our act of worship to God. First, though, let's have a definition of sacrifice. We have come to think of sacrifice as something that is laid down, given up, even lost for the sake of something or someone else. That is only partially true in the biblical sense. Biblical sacrifices were not given up, they were given over. Anything that was a sacrifice was something that was being given over completely to God to be used for His purposes and no longer available to or for the people offering it. Not given up, given over. The whole burnt offering was made as a sacrifice for sin. A perfect animal was required to represent the perfect life that God asks of us, but the person offering it had not lived perfectly. The worshippers would place their hands on the animals in an act of identification with them, and the animals would be completely given over to God, just as we are meant to be, but unfortunately fall short of. We see that concept carried over into Jesus' life and death. His was a perfect life, completely given over to God. In dying on the cross, He demonstrated that He would not hold anything back from God, but would even in that be completely given over. He kept nothing for Himself, but gave it all to God. In the same way, Paul is telling us that because God has been so merciful towards us, that there is only one proper response, that of being completely given over to God as an act of worship. Spend some time this week meditating on Romans 12:1. Remember, in meditating, we might repeat a word or phrase to let it sink in. Then we can contemplate that word or phrase, perhaps asking reflective questions. Above all, we want to hear from the Spirit. Let God speak to you from this verse. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship.